away from Blizzcon. He came back, won the last call.
And now going into game number 3, Druid versus Druid. It's a deck we've seen a lot of. It's a deck that every single player brought to the World Championship, but hasn't necessarily been the best performing deck.
No, especially against Pavel. Yeah. Druid against Pavel has an abysmal win rate. He 4-0'd both Omega Zero at opening week and Amnesiac here on the BlizzCon main stage. So DrHippi, he's got to be pretty scared of what's in store for him with this Druid deck.
Yeah, Pavel has had an excellent track record of keeping nature down. Has not risen against him very much. But we'll see who is the master of nature here. As DrHippi mulligans into what looks like a pretty bad hand.
Yeah, he does have Azure Drake, though. That's one of the good cards in the mirror. He does have removal, but Pavel has Wild Growth. He has Fandral. He has Mire Keeper. That hand is looking much better than DrHippi's.
Yeah, Pavel has the ability to ramp multiple times. This is a matchup that will often come down to just getting big threats in play that stick. And it's difficult for the Druid to really remove big threats because most of the Druid removal is based on damage. We see the swipes and Moonfires, Wraths. And if you are able to stick an Arcane Giant, if you're able to stick Ragnaros the Fire Lord, it can be very, very difficult for the other player to come back.
Yeah, one thing to note about the differences between these guys' deck is Pavel, as we've seen over the course of the championship, has those Dark Arakoas at that 6th slot in his decks, where, you know, DrHippi doesn't. I believe he has an extra copy of something, and he has Baron Geddon as well.
Yeah, it is worth noting many players chose to play Ancient of War. Ancient of War is generally accepted sort of the big taunt minion that you play in ramp-style Druid decks, but Pavel disagrees. He wants something that comes down a little bit faster, doesn't rely on him ramping quite as much, but still offers a big taunt body, and it's gotten him very far with that.
Yeah, he's been able to fill his curve quite nicely with those 6 drops, but now, I mean, he has Mire Keeper now to even ramp further towards whatever he may draw in the future. One thing you see, doesn't really have plays lined up for the future unless DrHippi were to develop something. If he Mire Keepers this turn, then he could go with something like Fandral Wrath into a potential Mire Keeper for DrHippi on the following turn.
And Pavel definitely taking his time here. We've seen Pavel play very fast in most of his games throughout this tournament, but he is taking his time. Druid is a deck that can often have a lot of options because between cards like Innervate and the modal cards like Wrath, you have a lot of different ways you can piece together your turns.
Yeah, DrHippi is going to ramp, but he just doesn't have too much substance to his hand. He's got Azure Drake as his only minion. He's got plenty of removal, but that's going to force him to sort of play reactively for most of the game unless he picks up big minions to play very quickly.
Pavel's going to go ahead and play his Azure Drake rather than play Fandral. This does set him up pretty directly into a swipe from DrHippi here. I think he may be trying to get more value out of Fandral, perhaps trying to set up Fandral with Raven Idol in order to get card advantage.
Could also try and set it up with Feral Rage. Feral Rage is usually a tool that is used to remove Azure Drakes and Mire Keepers in this matchup, and health can matter a lot when we get to the later turns because of Malygos.
It's also possible that he's trying to save the Fandral plus Wrath specifically for an Azure Drake.
Yeah.
Because the spell power from Azure Drake is extremely important with the number of damaging spells that are in the Malygos Druid deck, and he can line that up pretty specifically in order to answer the Drake.
Yeah, and at the moment he doesn't have any other way to answer in Azure Drake, where he did have the way on the board to answer the Mire Keeper. So definitely planning ahead here for Pavel, it seems.
Starfire takes that, and there's a Raven Idol. So immediately for Pavel, he is rewarded for his patience with Fandral and is able to get a double discover with his Raven Idol here. That takes pretty much just the highest impact minion available. This is a matchup that can come down to just who has a big thing. None of those were big, but Mount Raptor's the biggest.
Yeah, one thing that gets a little bit interesting as this game moves on is that neither of these decks packs hard removal, but they all have big threats of their own. So it comes down to sort of a war of giants later on. If you can, you know, be the first one to play giants, if your opponent doesn't have removal for it, you get a big initiative. But at the same time, if you do have removal for your opponent's giants, that puts you at a big advantage.
And Pavel's going to go ahead and coin out that Raptor here. It does make his board a little bit awkward for Hippie to deal with. The swipe plus hero power will be able to take out the Fandral, but not necessarily take out the Raptor as well. But he does have the ability to innervate out swipe with the spell power now from that Drake. And that can take out both of them, but it will leave a minion behind thanks to the death rattle of the Raptor.
Yeah. We'll see what it is. Usually not impactful.
Oh, Angry Chicken in the World Championship Finals. Let's hear it for Angry Chicken.
That's a lot of Angry Chicken fans.
I mean, who isn't an Angry Chicken fan?
Great
Think
point.
about it.
Yeah. Well, Pavel has some interesting options here. With the Angry Chicken, it allows him to Wrath. He could Wrath, Innervate Arcane Giant, I believe. He had enough mana to do that.
Ooh! Cairn comes out of the Moonglade portal.
Pavel is the master of portals.
He has had some excellent portal results this weekend. Usually you think of Cairn hanging out in Thunderbluff, but I guess he was visiting Moonglade. I was just like, all right, I'll come hang out too.
This is actually huge. The Cairn from the Moonglade portal means that Pavel is almost guaranteed to have something on the board going into the next turn. One thing to note though, DrHippi does draw the Malygos, and as we talked about earlier, this deck does lack hard removal. So if you can just slam a Malygos on the board, clear it, your opponent usually doesn't have a direct answer for it unless they got something from Raven Idol or they have a ton of damage spells in their hand.
And you know, DrHippi kind of in the tank here, trying to figure out what he's going to do against this Cairn. Looks like he's just going to use a lot of resources to deal with it. I'm going to go ahead and swipe plus face tank with Scape Shift.
That is very tough to swallow if you're DrHippi, having to use multiple removal spells to remove that 6-drop from the board, and Pavel's just going to keep the train rolling, nourish to get himself some more cards, more spells, more removal.
Innervate a Giant. It's down to 6 already.
Well, yeah.
Yep, there it is. So Pavel on the board with an Arcane Giant and still Bane Bloodhoof. So he has a lot of pressure here. It's not going to be easy for DrHippi to answer.
No, he does have Yogg-Saron. It's still a turn away, and actually it's relatively early in the game. He hasn't casted too many spells so far. But it is sort of that wild card in this matchup. Both players have it in their deck. There was a lot of players in opening week who chose not to bring Yogg-Saron, and there was sort of a mix and match. Some players got rid of it, some players put it back in. A lot of players are still undecided on whether or not that card is worth it in their competitive decks because of its inconsistency.
Yogg-Saron is the card that, prior to the change, was very effective at generating resources because you could draw a lot of cards, put a lot of secrets in play, even if Yogg-Saron did end up killing itself. But now it's pretty much only a card that's good when you're behind in a game, and even then isn't reliable in terms of a way to answer your opponent's threats. But for Druid in particular, Ramp Druid, you could often really struggle to deal with a big board, and Yogg-Saron offers the ability to do that in worst case scenario.
Yeah, and DrHippi uses the Nourish to try and draw into some more removal. But the thing here is Pavel's just going to keep generating threats. And while Druids can sometimes deal with one big threat, a full board of big threats cannot be dealt with very easily.
I'm actually a little surprised to see this snap Emperor Tharson from Pavel here, because DrHippi just used Feral Rays to just gain armor. That is about as much as you can telegraph the fact that you're about to play Yogg-Saron as I can imagine, but Pavel does get the discount on Swipe and Living Roots. That does make his own Malygos win condition much more powerful later on. So if DrHippi does choose to go with Yogg-Saron this turn, it will be a 7-spell Yogg-Saron. We see just drew a 5-cost Arcane Giant. A little bit of math there.
He can make it more. Yep. It looks like he's going to make it at least 8. He's not going to use Moonfire and Living Roots, though, but this is an 8-spell Yogg-Saron.
All right. Bow down to the god of death. Whose hopes are ending here?
Uh-oh. Innervate.
Oh, Ancestral Spirit.
Oh, no! Another Innervate. Tracking. Now, keep in mind, Tracking can actually skip over his Malygos that's in his deck. So there may no longer be a Malygos in DrHippi.
Fortunately for DrHippi, he does have it in his hand.
Well,
so
it could skip over a big minion.
This is actually incredible. DrHippi killed nothing. He actually resolved the entire Yogg and nothing died. In fact, he just gave Emperor Tharson another life. He did remove his ability, but that was absolutely not what he needed from that Yogg-Saron. Yeah. There's 17 damage on board. I think Pavel just has lethal here pretty clearly from his hand.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of spells.
Oh yeah, this is just going to be it. So Yogg does not answer DrHippi's prayers, and Pavel takes the lead 2-1.
Impressive stuff from Pavel.